weekend is the ancient Roman festival of Nemeralia. And Nemeralia was a festival in honor of the goddess Diana. Ovid describes this festival. In the Aresian Valley, there is a lake surrounded by shady forest, held sacred by a religion from olden times. On a long fence hang many pieces of woven thread, and many tablets are placed there as a grateful gift to the goddess. Worshippers would form a shimmering procession, carrying torches and candles and lamps around the dark waters of Lake Nemi. It's an ancient volcanic lake. It was formed about 40,000 years ago, and it's now 16 miles southeast of Rome. The lights of worshippers' candles combined with the light of the moon all reflected on the water. Hundreds would come wearing wreaths and flowers. Plutarch wrote that before coming to the lake, worshippers would wash their hair and put flowers in their hair, and even pet dogs came dressed with flowers. Travelers came in small boats lit with lamps. Worshippers would leave offerings and make requests on small written messages on ribbons tied to trees. There was dancing and singing and music and fruit and flowers everywhere. And I couldn't help but notice that you have a tree here with ribbons and flowers tied to it. And that's exactly what people used to do 2,500 years ago at Lake Nemi. Diana, as you know, was a goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, and fertility. She was a patron of hunters, of women, and of healthy childbirth. She's identified with the Greek Artemis and was a virgin huntress. Images of her always include a bow and arrow, a hound, or a stag at her feet. And if you want to see a statue of Diana, just go to Newfields, and about a little bit southeast of the formal gardens next to the Lily Mansion, there's a statue of Diana. There's a pathway there where there's lilies and ferns, and you can see her on the right. She has a quiver and a stag at her feet. It's a beautiful rendition of the goddess Diana. The Nemeralia festival was so popular that records show people continued to remember Diana into medieval times. The Catholic Church, as they have done so many times, stole the festival. And they changed the names and called it the Feast of the Assumption at this time. And of course, the Feast of the Assumption also features another virgin goddess of sorts. So what do we mean by the word God or goddess? A god or god, if you look in the Webster's dictionary, is typically a spiritual being, one who's transcendent, has special powers, and lives in a non-corporeal existence. Originally, the ancient Romans believed in what they called noumena. The noumena were spirits that inhabited sacred places like lakes or rivers or groves of trees or a sacred well. They didn't have names, they didn't have a gender, and they didn't have a physical form. Eventually, through the influence of the Greeks and other Mediterranean religions, the Roman noumena acquired the names that we know from our studies in mythology. Now, just to set things straight, the word pagan we use, sometimes that makes people a little nervous, but that word is simply a word that was used to describe people that lived in rural areas and were not necessarily as civilized as people who lived in urban areas and were not Christianized. They usually believed in their own personal gods and local deities and spirits. Eventually, once the ancient Roman civilization developed, there were named gods and goddesses for everything. So, for example, if you had a child that went out playing and you wanted to make sure your child found its way back and its steps were secure, you could invoke the goddess Adiona, would help you with that specific thing. And if you wanted to make sure your child ate well, there was a goddess for that too. Her name was Adusa. And if you wanted to have a talkative child who was a fabulous public speaker, then there was a god named Fabulinus who you could talk to and say, please help me speak well today. And of course, we all know the spirit of Nike. That is a personification of victory, not only for athletics. Nike was invoked for victory in any field, including biology, music, art, science, business. So every place, every object, process, and concept could have its own spirit. So what happened since then? Before, everything was full of gods. Today, the materialistic and scientific point of view posits that nothing is full of gods. How do we get here? Well, the rise of Abrahamic religions, especially Christianity and Islam, was one reason. It's not easy to maintain your belief when you're threatened with torture and death. So that's one thing. Another reason, and perhaps the more powerful one, was the rise of science. In his book, Galileo's Error, the philosopher Philip Goff explains that it was Galileo who defined what science was and what it meant to be scientific. And basically, Galileo was the first one to say that the laws of nature are mathematical. That's one. Mathematical means what's measurable, that's two. And anything that's measurable means that we have to have a mathematical equation for it. So that's three. And so he said if we can't have a mathematical equation, then it's not science, it's superstition or it's religion. And that's why science actually became so powerful. That's why we have electricity and the microphone and all this stuff. There's nothing wrong with science, but that was the idea, mathematical equations. So since then, science has gotten more and more powerful and has absorbed all the domains that religion and superstition used to inhabit. Even philosophy became more scientific. In the 20th century, the most fashionable belief system in philosophy was logical positivism, which is a view that reality consists only of logic and empiricism. And when I was taking philosophy classes, I met a few logical positivists, and believe me, they're not much fun. I mean, you don't want to go out for a beer with them. But that was it. That was the way to think. So this all started to change in the 70s because the materialistic view of reality was not adequately explaining one thing, and that was consciousness. Consciousness was a thorn in the side of the materialistic evangelist. So we use this word consciousness. We use consciousness, soul, being, spirit, personality. We use that all interchangeably, so maybe it's a good time to really define this idea of consciousness. And of course, it has to do with us being aware of ourselves. That's important. That's one side of consciousness. And then, of course, it's us being aware of our environment. And then it cascades. So us being aware of ourselves, being aware of ourselves, and being aware of ourselves, being aware of our environment. And that's the complex of consciousness. We are conscious beings. And there were a number of influential papers about consciousness written in the 70s and 80s. And then in 1995, David Chalmers famously formulated what he calls the hard problem of consciousness. And that changed everything. And I'd like to demonstrate with your green shirt. You can leave it on, okay? It's okay. Yeah, right. So I'm seeing your green shirt. Now, the easy problem of consciousness, I'm seeing your green shirt, and I see the green color. Now, science knows that green has a certain frequency of light, right? It's close to blue and between blue and yellow, right? Okay. And we also know that there's ambient light here that's reflecting off of your shirt, going into my eyes, it's passing through my cornea, it's going in the lens, it's hitting my retina. We know there's rods and cones in the eyes. Science has figured all this stuff out. It's amazing. We know this stuff. And it goes in the optic nerve into the visual cortex, and we process this information. That's easy. You know this now. Okay, but when I see your shirt, something else is happening. I'm experiencing what it's like to see the color green. And there's nowhere in the brain that we found that that's happening. I'm experiencing being here. I'm experiencing this bright light. Yes, scientifically we know what it is, but the experience of it, the phenomenological experience of it, is beyond scientific explanation. David Chalmers, the fellow who first formulated this idea, made a bet with a neurophysiologist Christopher Koch. He said that in 25 years, you're not going to figure out. And they made a bet. And just recently, it was a couple weeks ago, Christopher Koch admitted that he lost the bet. And he gave David Chalmers a very expensive case of wine, because that's what they bet on, that they haven't found in the place in the brain. They thought they were going to find the specific square millimeters where this experience of my seeing green is in there. And if I extracted it from my brain, then I would stop experiencing green. Well, that's not happening. And so they also made another bet in 25 years from now. The guy's not giving up. He's going to say, another 25 years, I'm going to find it, you know. Well, okay. So hardcore materialists, that's what they're hoping for, but the Philip Goff was saying that rather than trying to account for consciousness in the physical, like non-conscious way, he's saying that simple forms of consciousness are postulated to exist as fundamental aspects of matter. And that's what panpsychism is. It's a belief that consciousness, or what the ancients would say, spirit, imbues everything, like a gravitational field or flow of energy, and even the smallest elements of matter possess a form of this consciousness. And so there are many modern theories of consciousness. Giulio Tononi came up with this integrated information theory where he says a system is conscious if it's aware of itself and it's also aware of its environment, like we talked about before. Another neurophysicist, Susan Pocket, believes that there are three-dimensional electromagnetic field patterns in our brains are actually conscious. It's easy to believe we're conscious. I believe I'm conscious. I'm sure you believe you're conscious. Okay, let's try to stretch a little bit. Okay, do you think your pets are conscious? I would say yes. I think if you have a dog, anybody have a dog, right? It's conscious, right? It knows you. It can tell you what, knows its environment, and anybody have cats? Believe your cat's conscious, right? I know cat owners. They're going to tell me that my cat's more conscious than I am, you know? That's what they're going to say, you know? Okay, that's easy. Okay, what about other things? Okay, what about bacteria? Do you think bacteria are conscious? You know, it's a weird thing to think about that, right? Okay, so James Shapiro, he's a bacterial geneticist. He worked for 40 years at the University of Chicago. He wrote an article entitled, "Bacteria Are Small, but Not Stupid." I'll read a little bit of the abstract. 40 years experience as a bacterial geneticist has taught me that bacteria possess many cognitive, computational, and evolutionary capabilities unimaginable in the first 6 decades of the 20th century. Examination of colony development and organization led me to appreciate how extensive multicellular collaboration is among the majority of bacterial species. They utilize sophisticated mechanisms for intercellular communication and even have the ability to commandeer the basic cell biology of higher plants and animals to meet their own needs. This remarkable series of observation requires us to revise basic ideas about biological information processing and recognize that even the smallest cells are sentient beings. Dr. Shapiro, University of Chicago. Okay, so let's say we accept his view. And what about plants or fungi? Are they conscious? Suzanne Simard's publication in Nature, this is 1997, gave impetus to research in what is now called the Wood Wide Web, which is a system of this mycorrhizal fungal networks within roots and plants. Fascinating. We're just beginning to understand how incredibly complex this system is. Merlin Sheldrake wrote a book called Entangled Life. He talks in depth about this. I highly recommend it. These fungal networks, they coordinate their behavior. We don't know how. They communicate over long distances. We're not quite sure how they do that. If they're using a language, if they are, we don't know what language, how it works. We do know there's a large fungal network in Oregon. It's 2,470 acres big. It's huge. It's one being. It's one creature. Scientists estimate it's between 2,000 and 8,000 years old. and it's been around that long. In one side of consciousness, trees supply carbon to fungal mycelia in the soil, while the mycelia provide minerals to the roots of the trees. They're in a symbiotic relationship. So you have these roots that need minerals, and the fungal networks live on dextrose and sugars, so the trees say, okay, you're my friend, great. What's interesting, though, is when the trees are young and growing rapidly, they take a lot more from the fungal network and then they give back to it. But when the trees are old, the trees give a lot more back to the fungal network than they take. So let's pretend that we translate that behavior in human terms. We would say it's a smart investment, right? I'm a fungal network, I'm going to invest in this. Let's say I'm a startup. I'm going to invest in this startup, right? And I'm going to say, okay, I'm not going to make any money now, but in 10 years I'm going to have a windfall. That's what these fungal networks are doing. We don't know how they do that. We have no idea. We don't know if they have a sense of time or if a sense of a prescience about their health as time goes on. But this system is happening. I'd like to talk about broad bean plants. Agnello Guerrieri, he published in Ecology Letters his work with broad bean plants, doing these incredible experiments. So these bean plants emit a chemical when they're attacked by aphids. They emit a chemical that attracts wasps. The wasps comes and get rid of the aphids. Okay, it gets better. So not only does this one broad bean plant, if you have 20 broad bean plants and a little stand of plants, right, the other plants will start emitting this chemical, even though they're not attacked yet by wasps. By aphids, excuse me. They'll emit this chemical, so the networking effect, and they are getting these wasps to help them get rid of their aphids. So scientists is trying to figure out how are they doing this. Maybe it's wafting through the air. There's some kind of thing that the plant's picking up. So he put a bag over this one bean plant, put aphids on it, and yet the other bean plant still reacted and started sending out their message, and all these wasp kins got rid of the aphids. Okay, great. So it's not in the air. So then he did some really sophisticated experiments with hydroponics, and he learned that it's actually going through the root systems, and the bean plants are using L-DOPA, which is a human neurotransmitter, to communicate this message. It's acting as an insecticide. Not that it's killing the aphids directly, but it's eliciting a response from helpers, from other insects. And even more remarkably, they've also discovered that it has a dual purpose. This L-DOPA serves as an herbicide for non-bean plants who can't develop root systems next to the bean plants. So the bean plants don't get overwhelmed by weeds when they're using this system. It's remarkably intelligent. Okay, so I'm thinking these are conscious creatures, and they're obviously aware of their environment and aware of themselves. They're doing self-preservation actions. What about non-living things? This gets a little more difficult. So I was talking to Amy before. Thank you. I was rock conscious, and geez, how do you accept that? Well, think about this. Like the Earth was called, remember the Gaia hypothesis, where the Earth is one big conscious creature, as it were, and it's got a single self-regulating system maybe, or it's a consciousness, living and non-living elements all combined come up with this consciousness. Okay, so I'm thinking about this idea, and I'm doing some research about this, and I'm going to throw out a really remarkable thing that's been happening. And I'm not saying this is not speculative, and it's a little bit pushing the edge of credulity, but I'd like to share this with you. So as you know, what's causing so much climate change and degradation and pollution is this destruction of the rainforest, okay? And that's why are people destroying the rainforest, and getting rid of all forests in general is they want to have clear land so they can raise animals, and typically beef, lamb, pork, and all that. Okay, I'm not a vegetarian, okay, just throw that out there, but this is what's happening. And if I were planet Earth and they were getting rid of all the forests and, you know, getting rid of the lungs of the world, as they call it, well, I'd get pretty angry about it and I wouldn't want to change it, I would think. I would not like this somehow. But I wouldn't want to kill everybody because that's not a good thing. It's not morally good. So maybe I could change people's tastes. Maybe I could change people's attitudes. Maybe I could change their whole appetites, that they just don't like to eat this kind of meat. Maybe they'll eat more chicken instead, or who knows, or fish, you know, I don't know. And yet this is happening. I think this is happening. It's called alpha-gal syndrome. And we haven't heard about this. It's not in Indiana yet. But it might be. Okay? I'm not making this up. It's alpha-gal syndrome. It's transmitted by the Lone Star tick. It's kind of like Lyme disease, but it's actually a protein. It makes people allergic to eating mammalian meat. About 500,000 people have this already, they estimate. It's spreading rapidly. Basically, after 2 weeks of getting bit by this tick, a person will get hives, diarrhea, sometimes they'll go into anaphylactic shock. It's very dangerous if they eat meat, that kind of meat. The warmer it gets, the more tick spreads geographically. And I would like to think, considering my studies in consciousness, that this is not just a random thing that happened. I really would like not to think that. I think this is actually something that's happening. It's very clever. It's like almost like biochemical warfare in a way, you know? And yes, I'm not saying, how can I prove that? Well, I can't prove that, but I can definitely say that scientists are worried about this. And the problem is that they don't know how to diagnose it, and people are having these incredibly difficult allergic reactions, and a lot of them don't know where it's coming from. Okay, so we talked about consciousness in us, in dogs, in bacteria, and we talked about consciousness in plants and fungi, and now we talked about this big picture of the earth. And what about the sun? Do you think the sun could be a conscious creature? And this is the last example I'd like to talk about, the sun. It's Rupert Sheldrake. This is Merlin Sheldrake's father wrote an article in the Journal of Consciousness Study entitled, "Is the Sun Conscious?" And he actually he makes a good argument, because when we talk about consciousness being the electromagnetic waves that are in our brain and the idea of integrated information theory, where we have all these systems working together to give us a sense of consciousness, well, the sun has these huge electromagnetic systems and acoustic waves, and it's so much bigger and it's so much more sophisticated than our brains as far as all these electronic patterns are concerned. We don't even know what's happening in the sun. Our knowledge of it is just so minuscule because it's so large. And he was doing a meditative experience about this. What would it be thinking? Let's say the sun were conscious. What would it be thinking? Well, obviously it would want to preserve itself and the solar system because that's its domain, and it's actually doing that because it's sending out this incredibly strong solar wind, which goes to the edge of our solar system. And the Voyager 2 satellites just started picking up the edge. You know, they call that when the solar wind prevents the radiation from the galaxy coming into our solar system. It's almost like it's acting like this magnanimous being that's protecting everybody. And so yes, the sun could be a conscious being. So in summary, from the ancient world where spirits were everywhere to the modern world now where consciousness could conceivably be in everything and everywhere, we've come full circle. And we know we are conscious, and we know that other creatures are conscious, and we even are now thinking that it's possible that inanimate objects could have a consciousness of their own. And so I'd like to close with an affirmation. May we all enjoy the creativity, the abundance, and good health that this beautiful time of year conveys to us. And may we also enjoy the awareness that there are myriad forms of consciousnesses, and that consciousness flows through us and through everything in the universe.